Introduce the panelists and just briefly discuss the format of the forum before we get started. First off, we do have Professor Jill Weber-Lenz. She is a professor of law and the Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development at the U of A School of Law. She is a leading expert on legal recognition and treatment of stillbirth. She has written about stillbirth within the context of tort law, remedies law, criminal law, maternal health care, and reproductive rights and justice. So she is certainly an expert on this topic. We also have Arkansas State Representative Nicole Clowney, and she is serving in her second term. She represents the 86th District, which does, of course, include large portions of Washington County. She serves on the Legislative Joint Auditing Committee, the House Insurance and Commerce Committee, and the House Judiciary Committee. She's also a lecturer in world languages, literatures, and cultures at the U of A too. So we're excited for her to be here with us to talk about the politics of this issue. Dr. Kathleen Whitehead Paulson is a leading OBGYN at the Pat Walker Health Center, and she is a board-certified gynecologist and fellow of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. She earned her Doctor of Medicine at The Ohio State University College of Medicine in Columbus. And then she earned her Doctor of Medicine, completed her residency, in obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Missouri, Columbia. She has been with the U of A since 2017, so we're excited that she could be here to talk to us about what's happening at the U of A after this decision. So thank you, panelists, for your willingness to discuss this topic publicly, and also to you that decided to attend this panel, and because we know you understand the importance of this topic and want to hear from our experts. So I would like to have a discussion tonight about the future of reproductive health care in Arkansas after the Dobbs decision, but that will also require that we look back to what's been happening in the state before Dobbs. I would like to pose a question to the panelists and allow them to kind of trade dialogue in an informal, conversational manner. And then we'll move to the next question as it appears that everyone has kind of said what they wanted to say. We may occasionally go out of order on questions or come up with new questions based on the dialogue. Our questions are mostly from the members of the local 965, and so they're not all inclusive, so we will leave time for questions at the end of the panel. We'll probably take up to about an hour, and then we'll ask that if you have questions, you come up to the microphone here at the front, just like standing at the front on a spelling bee before the panelist, and ask us your questions. If you don't feel comfortable being before the mic, we could certainly allow you to ask them from where you're standing too. Okay, without further ado, the first question that we have prepared tonight for the forum really gets to the heart of what is currently happening at the U of A. What reproductive health care does the UA currently offer? Maybe Dr. Paulson, you could take that question first.
Thank you. I have to press this for you to hear me.
Possibly.
Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you very much. Well, at the Pat Walker Health Center and the GYN clinic, we offer counseling regarding preconception, infertility, contraception, and pregnancy options and how they can be managed. Then we send people into the community to get the care that we do not offer at Pat Walker Health Center, which essentially is anything surgical. Shall I elaborate on how the Dobbs has affected us?
Yeah, so if basically that's kind of a general understanding of what we have at the U of A. But yeah, has anything changed since Dobbs? Has anything changed since last semester before the Dobbs ruling?
A lot has changed over the last year. And can I give just a little bit of background to what's been going on in Northwest Arkansas and Fayetteville since Roe v. Wade became the law of the land back in 1973. Bill Harrison was an abortionist in Fayetteville. That's what he called himself. He was an OBGYN who performed abortions locally until his death. He started performing them in 1974, and there were other physicians and providers in the area that offered abortion services. But by the mid-'80s, he was the sole provider of abortion services because everyone else had succumbed to all kinds of pressure to get them to stop. In 2000, mifepristone, or RU-486, became FDA approved in the United States, and then Planned Parenthoods began, and other clinics began offering medication abortions. So in Fayetteville, we then had two providers, Planned Parenthood for medication, and then Dr. Harrison for procedural abortions. So we had fair services at that time, but with the death of Dr. Harrison in 2010, that certainly took away quite a bit of our availability. And then in July of 2019, our Planned Parenthood closed because of harassment by protesters that was not limited by the person who owned the space that they were renting. The person previously had kept protesters off of his property, but then changed it such that they could be as far up to almost to the door, and it became too much of a risk. So we lost our Planned Parenthood. No further abortion services were available in Northwest Arkansas at that time. And then, so at the University of Arkansas, when we have students that have a crisis pregnancy and want counseling for it, we would always tell them about availability for the services they're looking for. And half of our students are from Texas. Unfortunately, a year ago, when SB 8 passed in Texas, that got rid of a lot of availability for them. And another one of the problems is that so many of these people seeking care had to migrate northward to get services, which made it harder for our patients to get appointments. It would take 2, 3, 4 weeks to get an appointment. Most of our patients were going to Tulsa because it was the closest, being an hour and a half away. And the last time I called Tulsa to ask about how long it would get a patient in, they said it was going to be weeks because 60+% of their patients were Texans. And then in April of this year, the biggest change to where we can send people was when the Oklahoma law, SB 612, was passed. And there were no further abortion services in Oklahoma. That left only Little Rock, which was 3.5 hours away. And then the next closest was Overland Park, Kansas, 3.5 hours away. The problem with Little Rock is that, unfortunately, it had a 72-hour waiting period. So some of our patients were already going to Overland Park, Kansas. And then with the Dobbs decision on June 24th, I'll never forget the day, it essentially didn't change an awful lot about what we were doing because we were already sending a lot of patients north to Kansas or still south to Little Rock. It eliminated the Little Rock option. And then further and further north, our patients had to go in order to get those services. So what has it essentially done for us? The main things we've changed are we have to update our list of closest locations where people can get those services. It's increased our demand for contraceptive services, which is music to my ears. And it's increased the urgency of getting care for contraception. It's always been the mother lode of what we do in the women's clinic, but now we treat it as a semi-emergency. If a patient comes late, if she comes in at the end of the day, if she's trying to get worked in during the day, we'll just bend over backwards to make sure that they can get that care since the consequences are so dire at this point.
So I would imagine, well, there's a couple follow-up questions I have with that, but one, to be clear, the U of A does offer Plan B to those that ask for that prescription, and how do they access that?
Plan B is available over the counter now. We do not offer it in the clinic. We counsel people about it all the time, but we send patients to pharmacies where they can get Plan B. We're always staying up to date on who has the best price, and we know the names of the pharmacists. We know them all by name so that we can call them and find out who's got the best deal on Plan B. Plan B is progesterone only. It's a single pill that you take to prevent ovulation. It's not an abortion pill in any way, shape, or form. It prevents pregnancy. But we tell people where to get that, and then we provide a prescription for the other form of emergency contraception, which is called ulipristal, or the trade name is Ella, which you can get at pharmacies as well.
My second follow-up question, Dr. Paulson, is it sounds like this is probably putting a little bit of a strain on the staff at Pat Walker, trying to keep up with kind of the increased request in counseling. And now that you're treating these issues like a more urgent matter, do you see that putting a strain on them? I would assume that it is. Perhaps it's not, and you're able to keep up with the demands at Pat Walker.
I have to say our team is just so tight-knit and highly motivated. It almost revs us up. It's a challenge, and we just want to make sure the patients get the care that they want.
So is anything expected to change then after Dobbs? It sounds like things were kind of already changing and solidifying before that decision, and there really isn't that great of change that's happening after, or perhaps there won't be anything else that we should expect coming down the next few months in terms of what we can or can't access.
Well, for an obstetrician gynecologist who's no longer doing deliveries and doing prenatal care, I haven't done that for years. Practicing at the university, I do purely outpatient medicine. I do not keep hospital privileges. I just take care of the students. It's an 8 to 5 job. But my heart goes out to anyone who's practicing regular obstetrics and gynecology in the state of Arkansas. I cannot imagine the stress that they're under when they are put in a situation where a crisis comes in, a woman who's got ruptured membranes at pre-viability, for example, and they're trying to decide whether to get a legal consult first or to deal with the family and take care of them. Because I don't know if you all are aware, the law in Arkansas, if anyone performs or helps a person get an abortion, it's punishable up to 10 years in prison or with a $100,000 fine. And that gets the doctor's attention, obviously, but the hospitals as well are being very protective of their legal status. They don't want to get the lawyers dragged in. And believe me, all of you want yourselves and your loved ones to have the full attention of your caregiver when you're in a crisis situation, and not have them thinking about, well, how is this going to affect us legally? And believe me, that's what the hospitals are doing right now. So it's a very difficult situation. I would hate to be in it right now.
Thank you, Dr. Paulson. My next question might be a healthcare, but also might be a legal question. How will the ban affect other aspects of reproductive health care in Arkansas? For instance, making pregnant people wait for care even when their pregnancy loss is apparent, the vagueness of the exception to save the life of the pregnant woman, or the treatment for ectopic pregnancy, which is still legal, but again, many doctors may consider whether or not they should perform this due to the laws. Maybe Professor Lenz might want to speak to this first.
Sure, thank you. Yes, so abortion is illegal here, as we know. One exception that exists in the statute is that doctors can still legally perform treatment for an ectopic pregnancy. An ectopic pregnancy is when the fertilized egg implants otherwise not in the uterus. That pregnancy is not going to be successful, and if it continues, it can endanger the pregnant person's life. So fortunately, our legislatures and I should say the treatment for it is abortion, right? We end that fertilized egg so it doesn't develop, so the pregnant person isn't endangered. It is abortion, but fortunately, our law at least defines it to not be abortion, such that doctors can still do it. Otherwise, our only exception is to save the life of the pregnant woman. What that means is all the other times people need abortion care, it's not legal, right? And it could be in a pregnancy where miscarriage is inevitable. Maybe you go in for your 8-week ultrasound and they say, I'm sorry, but the fetus stopped developing at 6 weeks, but the heart is still beating. Well, one of the former treatment options there was abortion, usually a medication abortion, but doctors can no longer legally do that. So the pregnant person's only option is just to wait. Same thing as Dr. Paulson mentioned, if your water breaks at 18 weeks, doctors can't, that baby is not gonna make it, unfortunately, and again, that loss is inevitable. But doctors can't do anything right now, legally, as long as there's still a heartbeat, even though that baby is not going to make it, okay? And then at some point, it is legal to intervene, but only to save the life of the pregnant person. And I think that's an exception that we're all relieved is at least in the law, but we also have to realize that exception is very vague. Right? And to be crass about it, how almost dead does the pregnant person have to be? Right? How almost dead does one have to be before a doctor can legally intervene to save a person's life? And what if What if it's early in the pregnancy and the doctor says, if you continue this, it will endanger your life, right? So at 8 weeks, pregnant person is still safe, but if you continue, it will endanger the pregnant person's life. Is that then necessary to save the life of the pregnant person, or do we have to wait until the pregnant person is almost dead? And we just don't know those answers from the law. And as Dr. Paulson already mentioned, we've got hospital lawyers trying to figure out these answers, right? Because doctors are rightfully wary of the consequences. But I think we could all agree that the last person I want in the emergency room treating me is a lawyer, right? And I am a lawyer. I don't want lawyers involved. And the doctors are in a really tough place right now. But in the meantime, we also have to remember that that pregnant person is just sitting there waiting, right? And waiting until her life is sufficiently at risk, right? Sufficiently endangered that a doctor feels comfortable.
Might I just add something to that? While the United States of America is losing abortion protections, in 2018, the country of Ireland legalized abortion because of a circumstance very much like she was describing. A 31-year-old woman went to an emergency room with ruptured membranes at 17 weeks. Babies do not survive at 17 weeks. Their lungs cannot develop at 17 weeks. She knew that. She asked to be delivered multiple times, and the hospital refused to deliver her because there was still a fetal heartbeat. But by the time the fetal heartbeat was no more, she was already sick. And after multiple days in the ICU, she died of overwhelming sepsis. This was a woman whose life could have completely been saved had she been delivered early on when she asked for it. But they refused to do it because of the law in Ireland at the time. This was in 2012. It caused such an uproar that they had a referendum, and the vote was like, it was like 66 to 34%. That's what it was, in favor of legalizing abortion in Ireland. And it was exactly the scenario she was talking about. And I asked myself, how many women are going to have to die before we get our act together and change it in such a way that women's lives are protected?
So it certainly poses some anxiety for for people out there that are in their reproductive years, that gray area that Professor Lenz is speaking about, that doctors are trying to resolve, like when are we allowed, when should we do this? That is producing a lot of anxiety. And it seems certainly that the politicians made this decision, the lawyers are having to figure it out, but the doctors have been left out of the discussion. And that was kind of what brought up some of these court cases in the early 60s, a physician's right to practice their medicine. And so I think that, that's part of the missing, partly why we're having an element of this discussion that's missing, is the doctors have not been brought into the room. They're not helping to shape this policy. It's politicians and then lawyers that have to figure it out. That's anxiety producing. And here at the U of A, having spoke to my students and colleagues, that is where a lot of the anxiety is at. We have approached the University of Arkansas regarding their willingness to pay for travel costs for abortion care. Like some companies have started to offer, Fortune 500 companies are now paying for those travel costs and even more in some instances. But the U of A's response was pretty generic and somewhat expected. Their statement was that the Pat Walker Health Center on campus is dedicated to supporting the health and well-being of the campus community and will abide by state and federal law. And many people see this as a contradiction. Is it possible to serve the health and well-being of the campus community while abiding by these laws? Can we do that? Is that a possibility? And if so, how do we do that? Dr. Paulson, I don't know if you'd want to speak to that, or Representative Clowney even.
I will say that I wish it were as simple as that. I wish that we didn't live in a state whose legislature was committed to punishing publicly funded institutions for doing things that it doesn't like. But unfortunately, that is the state that we live in. That doesn't mean that we should be guided principally by fear of retribution. It does mean it's a real consideration. I think any time, and this is me speaking as a state legislator to be very clear, not as an employee of the University of Arkansas, anytime the U of A takes a stance, it runs a risk. It runs a political risk. I think that we need to be very concerned with protecting the health of our students and staff. I also think that we need to be as engaged in, if not more engaged, in efforts to change this from the bottom up. Our best bet is not going to be to somehow try to work around the existing law in Arkansas. Our best bet is to try to change it. And I say that as somebody who is, I don't want to say optimistic because I'm not, but I do think there's a real chance of it happening. When Dr. Paulson was just talking about the Ireland numbers, the votes in the Ireland referendum, right? 60-40 in favor of protecting a woman's right to choose. We saw something, as we all know, very similar in the state of Kansas immediately after the Dobbs decision came down. The state of the law in Arkansas right now, as Professor Lenz just described it, is so extreme that it's not at all representative of the majority of Arkansans' views. The problem comes into play in that while it may not be representative of a majority of Arkansans' views, it's also not the number one thing that has Arkansans voting. So when we have it as a separate own issue on the ballot, we see results like we saw in Kansas and Ireland. And if you look at the Arkansas poll, the numbers in Arkansas are actually very similar in terms of where people stand. I think it's an important difference. What I have heard so much of since Dobbs has come out has really brought to light for me the difference between two groups of people. Two schools of thought, really. There are people who are very against Roe, who really did not want Roe v. Wade to be the law of the land, who call themselves pro-life. There are people who fall into that camp who also disagree with how extreme Arkansas's ban is. And that group of people, where that sort of Venn diagram overlaps, is so much bigger than I understood until Dobbs came down. Most people took comfort, it turns out, in calling themselves pro-life. They took comfort in realizing, or thinking at least, imagining that should they or somebody they love ever be in need of abortion services, they would be somehow accepted, right? Their circumstances would be somehow so exceptional that it wouldn't really count. And there are surveys on this too, there are stats on this too, people who have had abortions who say, well, but my abortion didn't really count as an abortion for reasons X, Y, or Z. For so long, Arkansas legislators have had the backstop of Roe. They have been able to pass the most extreme anti-choice laws imaginable. They've been overthrown. And so they've gotten to kind of wear the mantle of pro-lifeness without actually having to pay the consequences of those extreme policies. What we're seeing now is that is no longer the case. People are not happy with this being the law. And so if we can motivate people to get out and change it, and I think there are ways, and we can talk about those later when the time comes, but I think that is where I would counsel the majority of your time as an activist to be spent, because I think that is the most likely to actually happen. I think when it comes to relationships between the university and the state legislature, they are very fraught and, kind of constantly, I don't know what the right word is to use. They are fraught, and there is often tension between the two. And it's a very, very fine line that the university has to walk. And I think that instead of asking them to put our status further at risk in the eyes of the state legislature, really a good use of time would be working hard to get the state legislature's voice to be different on this issue.
That actually segues to one of my questions is, what should we be doing politically in Arkansas? Because it's really easy to become pessimistic given the political nature and characteristic of this state. When it was a purple state, I think we would have had more confidence that we could do something. Fast forward 10 years later, and we're a really red state now. And so members of our community are concerned that no matter what they do, it's not going to matter. So obviously voting, getting out, getting registered, voting, asking your peers and neighbors to vote. Beyond that, what can we do, especially given the nature of politics in the state?
So I'd say not just voting. Voting is certainly so important, but I've seen so many people say, well, I voted and we're here, so a lot of good that did me, right? It's not just voting, it's getting everybody you know to vote. It's getting all of those people who have kind of, been in the middle, who are persuadable to vote maybe a different way than they're used to voting. I think there are lots of ways we can frame this. Give folks permission to vote a way that they might otherwise feel uncomfortable voting. Give them permission to vote for the Democrat in the race, because this issue is important enough to do it. So I think talking to your friends that live in districts that may be flippable, that's really, really critical, and I don't want to ever understate the importance of voting. Don't let the legislature sort of get to a place of comfort where they stop hearing from you. I can promise you, we are where we are. In other words, we have laws that reflect what a minority of Arkansans want, because that minority was really, really loud. I saw a tweet the other day that said, and I'm sorry, there's a swear word, don't underestimate the political, Don't underestimate the political power of being really effing annoying. And it's really true. Annoy your legislators when these things come up. Beyond that, I would say anything that is going to get this issue particularly, and it's by itself in front of Arkansas voters, is going to be the thing that changes it for us. In other words, do whatever you can, join whoever you can who is doing the work to get pro-choice measures put on the ballot. In the state of Arkansas, at least as of now, we'll see, it might be getting a little bit harder after November, but citizens can introduce ballot initiatives for the entire state to vote on. That is really hard work. It takes lots of signatures, lots of money, and lots of time. So if you have any of those things and this is an issue you care about, I would also encourage you to get involved. That won't be on the ballot in 2022. It will take years in advance. So the soonest we would see that would be 2024. Again, that's what we saw in Kansas. And hopefully, if we don't see electoral results in terms of who we're voting in, we can at least see results at the ballot box on this issue by itself.
I just wanted to add to that. I think it would be also appropriate for us to expect more laws. We've had a couple state legislators already comment that, hey, you can still go to Kansas, right? Or you can still go to Illinois. And we don't know the legal future of that, right? We don't know, if our state legislator tomorrow passed a law, criminalizing traveling out of state for abortion, certainly it will be challenged, but we don't know for sure how that's going to turn out, okay? And as Dr. Paulson mentioned before, with medication abortion being so much more accessible, we might see some legal measures targeting the use of that too. So I'm not optimistic either, as Representative Clowney said, but I think we should all be prepared that our state legislator could do more. And what that could possibly look like is punishing pregnant people, which has usually a step that we cannot pass. It has a bridge too far, if that's the correct phrase. And other measures specifically about medication abortion also.
And when you are considering how to do the work that Professor Lenz just mentioned or that I was talking about, it is exactly what Dr. Paulson just did. So it is sharing stories of how these policies are impacting or could impact people on the ground. If you have stories of your own, from your own history, if you know people who live through them, I cannot overstate how important that is, in particular to policymakers, to hear. There are so many things. I mean, I think just the fact that legislators would introduce a law that says the phrase, except to save the life of the mother in an emergency, shows how little they know. There are lots of things we may disagree on, but there's also a certain amount of just ignorance about the way that this all works and the way that this impacts real people's lives. So if you have stories or if you know people that have stories, I cannot overstate the importance of sharing those stories, particularly when these bills, and there will be bills, come before the legislature in our general session. That will happen this upcoming winter. So between January and March or April of 23 is when we'll see all of that happen.
Can I just say that one thing that gives me a little bit of optimism are thinking about how some of the large corporations are managing this. Take, for example, Walmart, August 19th, announced that it was going to expand abortion coverage. In other words, pay for services that are illegal in the state, which is just amazing. They expanded abortion service coverage to cases of rape and incest, to health risk for the mother, so it gives a much broader interpretation. They included ectopic and miscarriage, lack of fetal viability. I've seen cases like that multiple times, babies that are hydrocephalic and encephalic, they're not going to live. And yet, mothers are going to be forced to carry them to term that only puts them at greater risk. And it's also going to pay travel expenses for people who live more than 100 miles from the services that they need. So maybe the Fortune 500 companies are going to come out swinging because they know it's bad for business. Can you imagine how hard it's going to be to recruit talent to the state of Arkansas if someone has two choices? This person has two teenage daughters and they can go to a state where it's safe if you're raped versus one that is not. I think they're listening.
Yeah, certainly. There are so many things to think about with this in terms of the economics of this, the politics of this. One of the follow-up questions I had for Representative Clowney is the Arkansas Democratic Party using this issue to try to drive turnout in the fall? Or given that you mentioned it's not the highest issue on Democrats' mind or moderates' minds, so are they using this as an issue like the National Party is using it?
So it's a great question. For so long, there have been two things that we can't talk about in politics, right? We're always counseled. It's just too far. Cannot talk about guns and you cannot talk about abortion. Right now, it is crystal clear that popular opinion, not only is it right, but popular opinion is on our side. If there is a bright side to any of this, and I hate to even phrase it like that because the suffering that will happen as a result of all of this is so real, but I think it's also important to note that that suffering was happening in Arkansas long before Dobbs came down. There has been a decades-long attack on the right to choose. So all of that as a caveat, I will say that one of the bright spots is that Democrats nationally and on the state level are seeing the importance of speaking out about a woman's right to choose. It is so critical that we maintain those rights. Arkansas makes it particularly easy because our law is, as Professor Lenz said, pretty much free of exceptions. So it is certainly something that the party will be focusing on before, leading up to midterms. It is, while I always fight for what I believe is right for the state of Arkansas, it's really nice and unusual for me to be fighting for something that is so obviously right and also so politically popular, it turns out, right? This is what the majority of Arkansans want. The issue is to highlight it as something where the stakes are so high, it has to be the thing that determines their vote. Will that be? We don't know, actually. We don't know, and I didn't mean to indicate that it wouldn't be. I guess historically it hasn't been. I think if there were ever a chance that we saw people flip, we saw moderates vote blue who would typically vote red, I think it will be this time. It will be because of issues like this. And in fact, I've got colleagues who are knocking on doors who are telling me, colleagues from both sides of the aisle who are telling me that it is the #1 thing people are asking about. And this is not limited to people who can get pregnant, because everybody loves people who can get pregnant. And so it really is impacting all our Kansans in a way that I think even I wouldn't have expected. So yeah, certainly, it is something that is super important to all Democrats running, and that we will continue to fight for no matter how many of us there are come January.
And perhaps there are other issues that are going to be on the ballot in the fall that might also drive some of those voters that would be persuaded to vote for reproductive rights, the recreational marijuana that may be on the ballot in the fall, the high-stakes governor's race. The turnout is likely to be high anyways. However, we really do see the National Democratic Party, if they have the organization and the resources, to use this issue to drive that turnout, the interest groups that support the Democratic Party. That kind of raises the next question. Does the fact that Kansas overwhelmingly voted to keep abortion access mean anything to Arkansas legislators as they enter this new session? Are they looking at what happened to Kansas? Are they wondering if that's going to happen here?
No, Arkansas legislators, I hate to say that, but no, it doesn't mean anything to Arkansas legislators. I will tell you this, Arkansas legislators, as long as Arkansas remains so disproportionate in terms of its representation party-wise, as long as the imbalance between Democrats and Republicans stays as it is, all we will see is a race to the right as far as Republicans are concerned. I mean, that's just, I don't know everything. That's my guess. That's my instinct. Arkansas legislators who are pushing these extreme abortion laws don't care about what Arkansas voters want. They don't care about what their own constituents want, because as we are seeing, this is not it. Where we are right now is not what their own constituents want. So no, I don't think they particularly care about Kansas. If I were them, it would cause me to stay awake a few minutes later at night, though, I will tell you that, even if I wouldn't admit it.
We do see,
Just to add in too, for Kansas is a very different situation from us, because the Kansas Supreme Court found a right to abortion in its state constitution, okay? And then the legislators in Kansas sent this to the ballot in some very confusing language to try to amend the Constitution to get rid of the constitutional right to abortion. And that is what voters overwhelmingly rejected. So it was a big deal because it was Kansas. But it's also a very different situation than what most states have, right? Because we don't have, there aren't too many states that have found that right to abortion within the state constitution.
Yeah, so that certainly explains the difference between Arkansas and Kansas, and reminds me of the book we read several years ago, What's the Matter with Kansas? Well, apparently we might want to recheck that title, because they may be doing something right in Kansas if they are holding on to that while being a politically conservative state. I lived in Kansas for about 13 years, and it's very interesting in terms of the politics there. I think the fact that they have a larger number of large cities helps that state. It offsets some of the rural voting. There's a couple different questions I want to ask, but there's one thing I wanted to follow up with Dr. Paulson, and the fact that she brought up that, hey, Walmart, is typically thought of as a conservative-leaning company, but they're headquartered here in the state of Arkansas, and they and Starbucks are now offering travel assistance to their employees to access abortion within 100 miles of their residence. Given these companies often like to avoid politically contentious issues, can we really rely on their corporate support, or will this be like other social issues where they speak really positively up front, show a lot of support, but within a matter of months, once the issue kind of dies down, they back off? Could we expect Walmart to sustain support for this, or would they possibly back off in the next few months as Dobbs starts to calm down a little bit?
I can't speak at all to what Walmart might do, but I will comment that speaking of new laws that might come up, we might end up with we might have our legislator create like a civil cause of action against anyone who aids or abets in someone receiving an abortion. And well, then if we have someone providing funds for the abortion, I mean, we might have those two things probably can't go together. I have no idea how that would end.
I hate to even bring this up because it was at the time such a transparent kind of plea for attention, and so I hate to give it, but I do just want to give one example. Did you see the bill that was posted on Twitter? So immediately after this announcement that, I can't remember if it was Walmart or Tyson, I think it was after Tyson announced that they were going to cover those costs. There was a legislator in the state that posted a draft bill, and he said, I will be filing this. And the bill said, if any employer covers abortion travel costs for abortion, that employer has to provide, I can't remember what it was, so many weeks of paid parental leave. Obviously, we all want paid parental leave, but to weaponize it in that way was so, I just don't even know the word to use. I want to say juvenile, or it would be silly if it weren't an actual draft bill that were going to be filed. And it won't go anywhere because that is what this particular legislator does. But it is already being used as a way to target these companies. So just as Professor Lenz anticipated, we are already seeing ways that the state legislature will try. And we like to think of these corporations as kind of untouchable. The Arkansas legislature is trying to change that, is trying to make that very hard. We will see specific legislation targeting companies who try to help. I don't think that they will probably pass. I think that the majority of the legislators are more reasonable than that. But it is something to keep an eye on. We'll see it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that corporate support, if that is maybe able to kind of elevate the issue or take the issue to the tipping point, or if it just kind of explodes and they back down because of the nature of the political issue. But, it kind of gets to a lot of questions we ask in political science in terms of who's the principal, who's the agent, are those corporations really driving the agenda, or are they responding? And I think it's really difficult to say, but when we see these corporations lend their support and to other issues, these other social causes, they typically back off by 6 months or so afterwards. So a lot of us are hesitant to rely on that corporate support for those causes. So basically, I think you've answered this question too, but I would just, to clarify, that it is currently legal for a woman in the state of Arkansas to travel to access abortion care, right? But that could potentially change as we see these new laws kind of get proposed. So at this point in time, we really just need to really keep an eye out for that. It seems like we may not get that right back in this state, but certainly we want to preserve the right to access this right. So there's a lot of concern over that. What's going to, when I talk to students, they're concerned they're not going to be able to travel to Kansas City, but at this time they can. But they don't feel convinced that that's going to be a long-term right.
Sorry, I would just add that the laws right now are clear that you cannot apply them to the pregnant person, to the pregnant woman, is what the laws say. So whether it's the abortion law or the murder law, which very much also applies to the to the killing of a fetus, that is also very clear that it cannot be applied to the pregnant woman. Okay. That's what the laws currently say.
Lastly, I would just say, Dr. Paulson, you brought up Dr. Harrison. He was a voice I think we're really missing in this area for reproductive rights. He was actually my mother's OBGYN when I was born in 1973, and I really miss reading his op-eds in the Northwest Arkansas Times and the Arkansas Dem-Gazette. He was always a champion for these rights, but he did it in a way that didn't bring up politics. He wasn't trying to, suppress anyone or make them feel bad. He was always very educational about abortion rights when he spoke about this. I feel like maybe that's the voice we're missing in this area to help kind of explain why this is an important right. Do we see anybody in the area right now that's kind of taking on the cause of Dr. Harrison? Is there anybody that anyone can speak to that this is kind of our leading champion on this cause in Northwest Arkansas or Arkansas in general? Or have we actually pushed those people out of the state and we don't have those doctors anymore that can speak to that or that are willing to speak out on that? Anyone's willing to answer that?
I'm sorry, I almost had to laugh when he said that because that's very kind what you said about Bill Harrison. And he was a good educator, but he was also very feisty, and he would mock his protesters. If they didn't show up one day, he would call them up and say, where are you? Why aren't you here? And if they didn't have a good reason, he said, well, that's not very religious of you not to be here. He would also carry them cookies outside and thank them for advertising for his clinic. I mean, he was hilarious, but and when things would get kind of quiet sometimes, and I'd think, thank goodness they're not harassing Dr. Harrison anymore, he would write an op-ed that would get everything all stirred up again. So sometimes I think he liked stirring the pot a little bit, but he was completely and utterly dedicated to his patients. He even had a patient at one time who came and had an abortion performed, and the very next day she was out protesting him. The very next day. And I asked her, I said, how can you stand it? I don't know that I could have not said anything to her. And he said, oh, I didn't say anything to her. He said, those are just her people. So that's her problem. It's not, he said, but I did offer her a cookie. just to scare her, I guess.
Yeah, and so I feel like we are kind of missing that champion in the area to talk about why that issue is important, but antagonize a little bit the other side. And certainly with politics, there's a little bit of push and pull, and he was good at that. But, just my last kind of talking point would be that I think the protest over the years against reproductive care, and probably on both sides of the aisle, have amped up a little bit from what we might see in front of Dr. Harrison's office a couple decades ago. In fact, I worked at Consumers Pharmacy right near Dr. Harrison's office, and I remember seeing the protesters, but they had signs, they would be across the street. I don't remember them yelling obscenities or attacking the patients walking into the clinic, but that's what happens now. When these young women walk into these clinics, they are often emotionally attacked. The protesters are very aggressive with them, and they often throw things at them, fake paint that resembles blood and other things like that. And I feel like the rights of the women to just access this care privately has evaporated. The discussion used to be around privacy when we would talk about reproductive rights, and I feel like it's so partisan now that the discussion on privacy is really left, and these women are suffering. And I don't know if you have anything to say to that, but.
I would like to say that I wish that we did things the way a lot of other countries do. For example, in 2017, Canada made it legal for doctors and mid-level providers to simply prescribe the abortion pills, mifepristone and misoprostol, to be dispensed at any pharmacy so people could go home and manage an early pregnancy in the privacy of their own home and not having to walk through a gauntlet of people harassing them. So as I mentioned when I was talking about the history of abortion availability in Arkansas, it's just chips away until you have a constant one place where it happens and it makes it easier for people to be harassed. The more we can make it private by allowing more providers to offer that service and just let people pick up prescriptions at pharmacy, that would be so much better for the patients.
So my last question would be, or any parting thoughts that you have on this, what should women in Arkansas be doing to protect their health care physically?
The first thing is make sure you're not poor. And I mean that sincerely. Because 75% of women seeking abortions are poor. And and then use the most reliable form of contraception that you can absolutely find. 60% of women seeking abortions already have one child, and 30% of them already have 2 children. They're trying to protect the children that they have. And this may not even be what you were asking. I don't know if that's what you're getting at. But know how to perfectly use your method of contraception and always have a backup method, because remember, 51% of women who got pregnant were already using a form of contraception the month that they conceived. And then when you're ready to start your family, move to a state that's protective of your reproductive rights. It's frightening. I would be afraid to start a family under the current circumstances, because if I rolled into an emergency room with ruptured membranes at 17 weeks, or if my daughter did, or someone dear to me, I could not trust that they would get the care that they needed in this state at this time.
Well, that is certainly disappointing, but it is certainly food for thought and something we need to think about, especially those that are in their reproductive years. A lot of food for thought, but I think you provided some clarifying information, which does relieve some anxiety. But the information about the political, how to speak out, what to do about this, at the end of the day, we're gonna have to change the legislators.
That's right. Or at least change their opinions. And I do want to be really careful. I feel like I've been a little bit flip when I'm talking about my colleagues tonight, and I certainly don't mean to, because I truly believe I wouldn't be able to do this job if I didn't believe it. And I want to express to you all, I really don't believe that the vast majority of colleagues, my colleagues, put their head on their pillow at night and think that they are hurting people. I truly don't. I think that they are incredibly misled. I think that they are maybe even willfully blind. But I also think that there is something in there is a humanity in there that absolutely can be appealed to. I have seen it happen so often. And so I don't want to leave you all feeling pessimistic. I really want you to feel empowered, because the only way that this changes is if you share what you already know and already believe with the people who are making decisions. I heard a quote, and I say it pretty much every time I speak. This is Amber Goodwin. She's a gun violence activist, anti-gun violence activist. And her guiding principle is always get the people closest to the pain, closest to the power. And it's so important that you know how important that work is. So as we're hearing about how to protect our physical health going forward, you just heard some really good suggestions. I would provide a few more. They may be bad for your mental health, but I would say please show up to the state capitol. So I can promise you that next session, my colleagues and I will introduce bills that allow for exceptions. Is that far enough? Of course not. Is that as broad as we want the law to be? No. But there will be one bill that is filed that allows for an exception in the case of rape. There will be another bill that's filed that allows for an exception in the case of incest. A third will allow for an exception in the case of what we call a lethal fetal anomaly, like Dr. Paulson was describing. You find out that your baby is born literally without a brain, or some other devastating condition that means they will not survive after they are born. And then fourth, to alter that definition of life of the mother to provide for caring for the health of the mother. There will, I'm sure, be more things, but I can tell you for sure those 4 will be in front of legislators, and at least the committee will have to take a vote. And it is going to be much harder for people who are inclined to vote against choice to vote that way if they are looking in the eyes of people who have lived through the repercussions of those bad policies. So I cannot encourage you enough to get involved and to show up and to physically be in our space when we are making decisions. That's what you can do to protect your physical health and the physical health of so many people that can get pregnant in our state.
And we do appreciate some optimism at the end, because we definitely need that. Arkansas at one time was a purple state. It hasn't always been a red state. So I think there is some optimism. Plus, political activism has changed so many issues in our modern day history. It's hard to believe that our voices aren't going to be heard on this one, and that some of the legislature, that they do believe in what they stand for, the right to protect life. But, they're also motivated by winning. And so if they see a groundswell of support, if they see activism increasing in this state, they have to eventually pay attention to that. They want to hold on to their seats. They have to listen to what the voters want eventually. And if not, they may pay the price. So we do appreciate the optimism on that. We certainly need that because it is certainly a cynical time. It's very easy to be cynical on this issue and cynical on politics in general. So I always urge my students to get out there and write those letters, have their voices heard, get on their social media. That's important too. Often that's what the legislators appear to be paying attention to more is the social media. With that being said, we really would like to turn this over to the audience. We probably have not answered all of your questions, and we would certainly like to do that. Does anyone have a question they'd like to pose to the panel that they'd be willing to come up to the microphone or from your own seat if you prefer? It looks like you have a question in the front row. If you'd like to stand up, we'll let you do that.
Test.
Yes.
Hi, I work at the University of Arkansas, and my main concern, the points that really haven't been brought up as far as a society is concerned, is the economic cost of removing women from the workforce because they are pregnant. They don't necessarily, they didn't choose to be that way, and it's possible that they can't afford to go somewhere else for an abortion. So basically you're forcing women to carry children that they can't afford. There aren't enough social services to protect them. The children will be raised in poverty. The women will not have access to education or opportunity. I'm well beyond all of that, but my concern is for everybody else losing the right to live and have a productive life.
I really do appreciate that care and concern for these young moms. I myself was a young mom here in Northwest Arkansas. I had my first kid at 17 and my second by 20. And I had to drop out of high school and go to work as a result. And then work my way through my master's and PhD. And that set me back about, compared to other people in the same process, I'm probably about 10 years behind professors that are in my rank at the university because I started out so young and without any options or understanding of what my options were. And certainly I was poor, so that didn't help. My outcome is not going to be the traditional, typical outcome for most teen moms. I have a PhD. As Mike mentioned, I've written a couple books. I'm a professor at the university. Most teen moms are not going to end up like that. So that's the fear I have for our community, having been part of this community, been a teen mom, and been without those resources. I appreciate your emotion over that because I have it too. I lived it. And it's very difficult economically, emotionally, and you just want to give up when you're a young mom and you have no support. And so I know that my outcome will not be the outcome for most of those moms. I'm not sure how it happened for me, but it was a very difficult process, I assure you.
I just want to add also to, there's no doubt that access to birth control and then after Roe, that tremendously helped women stay in the workforce. I also I want to note though that we don't have the best, maternal mortality rates in this state. Our stillbirth rate, so I'm getting feedback, sorry. We have the third highest stillbirth rate in the whole nation. So that's a pregnancy loss after 20 weeks. I feel like we live under this idea that every baby not aborted is automatically born healthy, raised in poverty, but born healthy. And that's just not true. And it's almost double the chance for a Black woman in our state to have a stillborn baby as opposed to a living baby. So it's not only that we're maybe, forcing women to continue pregnant and then raise children, but we're also forcing trauma of pregnancy loss too, right? And that itself can also have its own economic consequences. So yes, I wanted to add that to the picture also.
The World Health Organization recently came out and expressed their sentiment on this and how important access to abortion care is to economic health and wellness. There is a link, and we can go back to the 60s and get into the dialogue of the movement then, that women were, the issues, the talking points that they had about, we will have no economic health if we don't have health care. That really seemed to turn some of the tide, those that were on the margins, those that were moderate, politically moderate, that seemed to turn the tide for them. We're in a more polarized time period than we were in the 60s. More people were in the middle. They were moderates. They agreed on a whole set of issues. There's very few issues that people can agree on today. You're either to the far left or to the far right, and the moderates are dropping out. And that is where, again, I think we need voices like a Dr. Harrison that can help bring people to the middle on this issue. Get it out of the partisan talking points. Refocus it on the economics, the health care rights. And if we don't maybe take back over the conversation, we need to kind of take it away from these political parties, these interest groups who are controlling it. I don't see how it changes. We have to refocus the conversation back onto, as it was just stated, the economics of it. Because, that is something we cannot afford to have, is more poor teen moms in the state of Arkansas. We couldn't afford them before. We can't afford them now.
I just want to add too, we need to make that conversation intersectional, because this is, we're sort of talking up here, but you can just go to a different state. That is not an option for so many Arkansans, right? So we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, as a young teen mom, I had never been out of the state of Arkansas. So, that wouldn't have been an option for me. So I appreciate that. Oh, great, we have another question.
I have a segue from that. And firstly, just want to say thank you so much. Thank you to everyone that's here. And I've been here since 2012, and I didn't know some of the history that you shared, Dr. Paulson, so I really appreciate you sharing that legacy for us now. As you noted, there's a lot of gray area in terms of if I were to be pregnant and show up at a hospital and you have an emergency situation, that's a really ambiguous area for women right now and also for healthcare providers. It was noted that attorneys and legal representation for hospitals are grappling with this right now, but I think it's also an important reality to note that attorneys that represent hospitals are representing their client, which is the hospital, right? And so my question is, does a pregnant woman in Arkansas need a lawyer, or does there need to be a nonprofit that's providing some of those advocacy services on behalf of someone that may, as you well noted, not be able to travel, especially when you're dealing with an emergency situation? So I'm kind of curious if you've seen anything on that.
Okay. Lawyers aren't always great at making things happen ahead of time. We're much more reactionary, and Representative Clowney, feel free to chime in on this. There's one more lawyer up here too, right? Yeah. You can't force a doctor to give you treatment. The only thing I can think of, though, is there is a federal law out there called EMTALA, and I'm sorry, I cannot remember what the acronym is. It's emergency medical care. And there's a federal law that mandates that ERs give emergency medical care. And the stuff within it's broader than just saving the life, right? It's more about if someone's life is in jeopardy. It's just the language is broader. So we're actually seeing some legal fights right now because Idaho has just as saved the life of the pregnant person, just like us. And the Biden administration sued Idaho and said, no, you have to have broader care than this, right? Because I think EMTALA also mandates care if an organ is in danger. So it's broader. Back to your question, though, I don't think you can get an attorney to enforce EMTALA beforehand. Right? But we should all know that that's out there, and honestly, it's probably going to be up at our Supreme Court sooner or later, because now we have an Idaho court that says federal law, EMTALA, dictates what we have to do, and we have a Texas court who said, no, Texas law prevails. So we have a conflict, so we will be seeing that head up also.
I also want to add to that, it's a really great question, and I'm glad that you asked it. And I'm ashamed of myself that it has taken me this far in to mention the name of the organization, Arkansas Abortion Support Network. But there are people who have been doing this work, who have been prepping for this reality for so long. To a lot of us, it was a shock. To the Arkansas Abortion Support Network and all of those folks who've been fighting in this fight for so long, it was not a shock. And they have been preparing for it, and they immediately started funding and organizing the logistics of, et cetera, sending people across state lines who need help. So I would say, that is a source of advocacy for these people, not maybe in real time, but at least very immediately after they are unable to get the care that they need. And I'd also say that if you are one of those people who is concerned with the pregnant people we were just talking about who don't have access to care that they need and don't have resources to get it themselves, certainly consider contributing to one of those organizations who helps provide it to those people.
Thank you.
Ozark Circle for Choice is another organization. Yes, of course, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This has been really informative and very interesting and actually, yeah, kind of inspiring in a time of not a lot of that around. I wanted to go back to the economic question and ask just how much are the most reliable methods of contraception for our students, and are our staff having to deal with the same costs? What is our coverage at the U of A for good contraception?
Ever since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, abortion has been, for people who are insured, much less expensive and much more available. Thank you, Obama. For example, the student health insurance covers, did I say abortion? Forgive me, contraception. The student health insurance, for example, pays 100% for the insertion, the removal, and for the device, for an IUD, as well as for an implant, which is also a fabulous form of contraception, the device, the insertion, and the removal. These are all very expensive methods, but 100% coverage for them. Same for most methods of contraception, the pill, the patch, the ring, the shot. And luckily, there's some pills that even if patients choose to pay out of pocket because they don't want their parents to get a bill, they're affordable for most people at $9 a month. So it was wonderful for women's health care. The Affordable Care Act was. By the way, I looked it up today. Nicole, perhaps you can tell me, is it true the current statistics about children in foster care in Arkansas? I read that there were 4,800 children in foster care, but only 1,700 foster families. It's unbelievable.
No, I mean, the statistics, all measurables are awful. I mean, as Professor Lensman mentioned, too, maternal mortality, number of women who deliver before term, number of people who deliver without ever having had a prenatal visit. We are either worst or second worst in all of those measures in the country.
Well, that's a little scary. We'll take our next question.
So, Lynn and I have been trying to get involved with, how do we get involved? What do we do? And we've gotten in touch with Arkansas Abortion Support, and nobody calls. Planned Parenthood, nobody calls. I've tried to do an internship with Planned Parenthood. I've tried to do different kinds of, how do we have energy and resources and we want to get involved. And so what I'm hearing is that we need to show up at Little Rock, tell stories, get people to vote. I almost want a bullet pointed list of but I don't know where to go to see when bills are being. Is there a website that's more specific? Because I'm always talking to the Arkansas Democrats Society and those guys, but I just feel like it's very nebulous. Like, I feel like we have a huge community that really wants to mobilize and do stuff and help get people where they want to be. But, and also, I've gone to the Arkansas Nurses Association, and nobody wants to talk about it. They're like, oh, it's too political. And I'm like, well, then we really should talk about it. But that's where, and I don't have a lot of experience on the Arkansas Nurses Association, but that seems like a place where there's a huge representation in the state of Arkansas of nurses, but there's a very limited amount of people who are involved with that.
Yeah, so this is an evergreen question on just about any issue that you care about, right? It's sort of where's the centralized group that is mobilized and has all of the to-dos. I would tell you when it comes to Arkansas Abortion Support Network, and I should have been clearer about this, I think their primary need is money. I think they are spending almost all day, every day, actually providing services, and so it's hard to kind of talk with folks that want to help in a more involved way. I shouldn't speak for them, but that would be my guess. I can tell you that there is an event, and this may not be a satisfying answer, but I promise if you go, you will be satisfied. There is an event on Shiloh Square in Springdale, I don't know if you know where that is, right off of Emma, on September 18th, so that's a couple Sundays from now, 2 p.m. And at that event, there will be, it's kind of a voter information event in general, but I know that there will be a booth there specifically dedicated to creating kind of a hub around these issues and hopefully creating exactly the kind of space that you're talking about. That group is still in its formation, but that they will be present at that event, and I think that is where I would direct all people who want to get involved to go if you want to sort of have a more immediate impact. Don't want to wait.
So the group is so much information that they don't have a name yet, just have to go.
Thank you.
Yeah, because that was the thing. It's like there's all these things, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel. I mean, we can reinvent the wheel but we just keep on coming up against walls where it's like, where the hell can I get involved? I can't get involved. I mean, like, how do I do that? So, this is a new group. Okay. All right.
Yeah, not all interest groups are the same. Some just do not have the organization and the resources that others do, especially for some of these groups that are kind of just really getting activated around the issues. That's why I would add the bullet point contributions to these groups. Sometimes our money can speak louder than our votes. And I would say that's where we maybe have to start to fuel some of these groups so they can get organized and and find, that they have better outcomes.
I just had a quick question about the legality and accessibility of the online early abortion pill. Because I see a lot of talk of that online, and I didn't know, is that accessible? Is it legal to have it shipped in, the telemedicine option? I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
I'll let one of the lawyers talk about the legality of it, but I can tell you that it is available. When students ask me about it, I talk to them about a website called Plan C, which gives you many of the resources where people can order the pills online. Unfortunately, I can't speak to the legitimacy of most of these groups. But for any of you who use that app on your phone that's called, what is it called? The one that we look up the inexpensive drugs. What is it called on our phone? GoodRx, thanks. I was shocked to see I looked up GoodRx and looked up mifepristone and misoprostol, and it had this fabulous write-up all about the abortion pill and how it's used and where you can order it. I could not believe the amount of information that was on that website, but it was wonderful. I haven't looked at it in the last weeks to see if it's still there, but yes, there are places where it can be ordered, and it's only been hearsay about people ordering it and receiving it, but sometimes it can take weeks, sometimes it takes more than that. And of course, we all know that medication abortion is very time sensitive. So look at the website Plan C and you'll see many of the options.
I guess I would say, I don't know how to toe this line. I mean, abortion is illegal, right? But currently the only person punishable for it is the doctor who prescribes. Okay, currently there is no punishment for the person who takes the drug. So I guess illegal, but consequences differ. I mean, these are all questions we don't know the answers to, right? Because, so, I mean, I feel like, you know, some states, there are some states out there, by the way, very much protecting their providers in state, all right? So, like Colorado, the governor has passed executive orders saying that, you know, if an Arkansan went to Colorado to get an abortion, and Arkansas wants to do something about that, maybe try to punish the doctor in Colorado. First off, we don't know if legally they could even punish the doctor in Colorado. But then the Colorado governor has said, we're not going to help with any of those investigations, right? So there's a lot of states that still have access that are doing things to protect their providers. And then we will see what the states that don't have access, that is now legal, how they try to counteract some of that.
So it's very complex, and that's a lot to navigate for a young woman making really difficult decisions. A lot of risk to calculate, it sounds like. Do we have another question?
I just have a question about how can I help to protect reproductive health as well as a minor without like one stable form of transportation, for example, because I switched between houses and mixed with school. So how can I help as a minor?
Transportation is such a barrier, and I don't want to, when I say things like, just go to Little Rock, I understand that for those of us who do have transportation, it is really hard. We're really bad at making our state government accessible to people in different parts of the state. I will say that, you know, outreach to people who are making decisions is really valuable. But I also think that as much as you can see being young as something that stands in your way, as an obstacle, as a barrier, I think it's something that is also really powerful. You, in particular, you know, your generation, y'all are gonna be the ones that turn this thing around. This is a long game, and that doesn't mean that we can't make serious strides in the immediate future. I think that we will in the short term, but also, your voices are really powerful. Talk about things, organize your friends, talk about things that you want to see in your schools. We have attacked sex education in our schools as a state legislature for a really long time as well. You cannot punish unintended pregnancies as severely as we are while simultaneously eliminating all ways to avoid unintended pregnancies, which we seem to want to do, right? By making access to contraception harder, by making access to sex education harder. So I think those are some things that you can get your people who are like-minded together and advocate for as people who are directly impacted by them, as students. That is a powerful voice. That is getting the people closest to the pain, closest to the power. You can do that.
And then to add on to that, how can I advocate for sex education in my school? Because we don't have any.
No, and most people in the state of Arkansas don't. And in fact, we're trying to make it illegal that they have any, or that it has to be abstinence only, or that parents have to approve the curriculum, right? It's very, very hard. See what people in other states are doing. Dream up in an ideal world what you would have, and then reach out to your legislator, who I hope is me, and let's talk about steps to take. I mean, I think every good idea starts with a brainstorm, right? What does that look like? What do you want? What do you need? You don't have to come up with it from scratch. Look at what they've got in other states. Hear what your friends are talking about in the hallways, and we'll go from there. But I promise you there's going to be both offense and defense to play this legislative session, and if what you want to get involved with is changing policy, then reach out to your legislator and get that conversation started. And if your legislator doesn't answer you and I'm not your legislator, reach out to me anyway, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. And speak out on social media, because
Yes.
that is your platform. And you guys have done so much in the last few years to push the issues forward on social media. But start a student group too, educate each other. Start to get that information, start to build that group and push. We've got time for one more question.
I know it's getting
No,
late.
no, you're good.
I worked in labor and delivery from 1980 to 2014, and then I taught nursing. I am very familiar with pregnancy terminations. I'm very familiar with incompatible with life situations. I'm very familiar with ruptured membranes and septic uteruses, and I've cared for patients that came in too late to get the care. I can't imagine what it's like right now. One of my questions is, I think what you've brought up tonight, and I think it's such an important point, is the idea that it's ignorance. It's just total ignorance. Now that the dog has caught the car, the ignorance of what disaster is being created here, and potential disasters, and how many women are going to have to die. But other situations that you get into, like infertility clinics, and how do people have any understanding, and how do we better educate the public and the ledge? Were they at one time going to magically take ectopic pregnancies, and you were supposed to put them in the uterus or something? That happened in some state where they were trying to legislate that. I thought, who is doing this? How do you deal with that ignorance, I guess? Or what do you recommend? As an old retired labor and delivery nurse, I feel like I could help.
Yeah, I think we all need a biology lesson. Like, I don't know how we can all get together and figure that out, but yeah, I mean, I mentioned this before, but I feel like 50 years of the abortion debate has just, we have these stereotypes of who gets an abortion.
Images of
Yes, right? Versus Dr.
full-term,
Paulson
fluffy
telling us
babies,
that,
and not of anencephalic babies or trisomies, or, there's just, people don't see the images of what it really.
like, who really has abortions. And then I feel like it was the one that was publicized shortly after Dobbs, that the 10-year-old victim in Ohio who had to go to Indiana. And somebody was testifying the next day, well, that wasn't abortion. She was testifying in Congress, and she said, that wasn't abortion. And I was like, what? And I just think there's so many misconceptions. Oh, abortion, that's just the promiscuous woman who does this for birth control. Like, I feel like we've got these such ingrained stereotypes. And otherwise, biologically, we think every conception is this magical living baby 9 months later. And in short, I'm with you. I don't know how to fix that, though. I do think what Representative Clowney was already saying about stories is helpful. I think more people who have actually been pregnant as our state legislators would be very helpful. I think about that a lot with the Supreme Court, that, I mean, I don't know how many, we can't say how many justices have been pregnant, right? But I do know there's only one on there who has given birth, right? Only Justice Barrett on the court right now has given birth, right? We obviously, Justice Ginsburg before her and O'Connor before her, but currently of who overruled Roe. So I think representation also plays into that.
Anyway, thank all of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's something about the lived experiences that I think matters, but there's so many issues these justices have decided on, but they didn't have that lived experience. There's something unique about abortion. When we talk about a mom and giving birth, and just all of that comes with that, kind of the the stereotypes of that, that I think it makes that issue just a little different than the other ones. And it's hard for the justices to make decisions and kind of capture the lived experiences of what that's going to be like for so many. With that being said, we've really appreciated our panelists for answering these very tough questions, complex questions, and providing some clarity and advice on how to move forward. I would like to give them a round of applause if you'd like to join in and do that, because we certainly appreciate this. There's, so few people willing to really kind of take that risk and speak out and educate the public. And it's a topic that's very controversial, as you might imagine. So we do appreciate your willingness to be here. And we appreciate your willingness to attend this panel. We have lots of snacks outside, so we ask that you please take some of those with you. And if there's anybody that has some questions they'd like to ask us personally, we could maybe stick around for a couple minutes. Otherwise, we'll just thank you again for attending, and the Fayetteville Public Library for having us. Thank you.
Yo,